A Navy SEAL sat alone inside a warm diner, one hand wrapped around a coffee cup, his eyes lost somewhere beyond the glass. Outside, snow fell hard over the empty street. Then he saw them. Two tiny German Shepherd puppies stood outside the window, trembling in the cold, their paws pressed against the snow, their hungry eyes fixed on the people inside. They were not barking, they were not running, they were only begging for a little food, and maybe for someone to notice. Most people looked away, but the Navy SEAL didn't. Then one puppy lifted its face and stared straight at him. Why did that one look stop him cold? And what was hidden behind those frightened eyes? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late afternoon had fallen over Maple Falls, Ohio, with the tired softness of a winter day that had given up pretending it would be kind. Snow drifted down Main Street in slow, heavy flakes, gathering on parked cars, shop awnings, and the shoulders of anyone unlucky enough to be outside for more than a minute. Inside Rosewood Diner, the air was warm with coffee, fried potatoes, and old wood polished by 50 years of elbows, gossip, prayers, and bills paid 1 week late. The windows had fogged at the edges, blurring the street into a pale watercolor of brick storefronts and white sidewalks. Mark Sullivan sat alone in the corner booth by the glass, one large hand wrapped around a cream-colored coffee mug he had barely lifted. At 46, Mark still carried the hard geometry of a Navy SEAL. Broad shoulders, a disciplined spine, a square jaw darkened by a neatly trimmed brown beard, and short dark hair touched with gray at the temples. His eyes were blue-gray, watchful, and often mistaken for calm. They were not calm. They were guarded. Years of service had taught him to notice exits, read faces, and measure danger before it announced itself. But it had also taught him something colder. Sometimes a few seconds could become a lifetime of regret. In his final operation, one hesitation, one human pause in a world that demanded machine-like certainty had cost a young teammate his life. Since then, Mark had become a man who disliked choices that did not come with orders. Coffee was simple. Snow was simple. Leaving town after selling his father's old house was supposed to be simple. Rosewood Diner belonged to Helen Carter, a 69-year-old widow with silver hair pinned into a loose bun, warm brown skin lined by laughter and worry in equal measure, and the kind of sturdy build that came from decades spent carrying soup pots, rent notices, and other people's troubles without setting any of them down for long. Helen had owned the diner since her husband Walter died of a heart attack behind the grill 12 years earlier. She had a soft voice, but not a soft backbone, and most people in Maple Falls knew better than to mistake her kindness for weakness. That winter, however, even Helen's backbone had begun to ache. The rent had gone up twice. The town council had warned her about leaving leftovers near the back door for people without homes and for stray animals. One councilman had used the phrase, "bad for the town image," as if hunger were a stain on a sidewalk and not a bell ringing in heaven. Helen still left food out when she could. She simply used older bowls and darker corners. From behind the counter, she watched Mark watching the snow. She did not ask him what he was thinking. Helen had served enough veterans, widowers, and lonely men with wedding rings still pressed into their skin to know that silence sometimes had to sit beside a person before truth dared to come in. Mark told himself he was only passing through. He had returned to Maple Falls to clean out his father's house, sign papers, and leave before memory could unpack its suitcase. The town had too many ghosts wearing ordinary coats. The barber shop where his father once forgot to pick him up, the train station where he waited as a boy with frozen fingers and pretended not to be scared. The church steps where his mother had smiled too brightly on Sundays because pride was cheaper than help. Mark had survived deserts, oceans, locked rooms, and gunfire. But Maple Falls made him feel 11 years old again, angry at the cold and angrier that he needed anyone. He lifted his mug, then stopped. Something moved beyond the window. At first, he thought it was wind pushing loose trash along the curb. Then the shape rose on trembling legs. 2 German Shepherd puppies stood beside a dented metal trash can outside the diner. They could not have been more than 6 or 7 weeks old. Their black and tan fur was wet, clumped with snow, and too thin against the weather. One puppy was smaller, narrow through the ribs, with oversized paws and ears that had not yet decided whether to stand or fold. It pushed its nose into a mound of soggy paper, shivering so hard its whole body seemed to flicker. The other puppy was slightly larger, not healthy but fiercer, with a darker mask across its face and snow dusting its muzzle like ash. It stood between the smaller one and the street, head low, little teeth showing whenever a passerby came too close. The larger puppy was not brave in the clean, pretty way people like to imagine bravery. It was frightened, hungry, and desperate enough to pretend it was dangerous. The smaller one found a crust of bread, tugged it from a greasy wrapper, took one bite, and then tried to drag the rest beneath a scrap of cardboard, as if tomorrow were already waiting with empty hands. Mark looked away, only for a moment, long enough to stare at the steam rising from his coffee, long enough to tell himself that someone would call animal control, long enough to remember that he was not responsible for every broken thing in the world. A woman in a red coat passed the puppies and turned her face toward the storefronts. A delivery driver stepped around the fallen trash can, annoyed at the mess but not curious about the small bodies shaking beside it. A young couple hurried past under one umbrella, laughing at something on a phone, their bright voices disappearing into the storm. Mark felt irritation rise in him, sharp and unfair. At them, at himself. At the puppies for appearing in front of his window like a question he had not agreed to answer. Compassion, he had learned, was rarely convenient. It walked in while the coffee was still hot and the heart was trying to stay closed. Helen came near with a pot of coffee and paused beside his booth. "Cold's getting mean out there," she said quietly. Her eyes shifted toward the window, and the lines around her mouth tightened. She had seen the puppies, too. Of course she had. Helen saw everything, especially the things people hoped no one would notice. Mark said nothing. His fingers tightened around the mug until his knuckles paled. Helen did not push. She only topped off coffee he had not drunk and added, almost to herself, "Some creatures don't bark because they expect help. Sometimes they've learned begging wastes strength." Then she walked back to the counter, leaving the sentence behind like a match struck in a dark room. Outside, the smaller puppy lost its grip on the bread and stumbled. The larger one moved quickly, blocking the wind with its own body, then shoved its nose deeper into the trash can. Metal scraped against the sidewalk. A few napkins blew loose. Something red appeared beneath the gray slush and brown paper. The larger puppy caught it in its teeth and pulled. A torn piece of knitted scarf slid free, bright as a small flame against the snow. The puppy stood there with the red wool hanging from its mouth, chest heaving, ears pinned back, eyes wide and dark. Then it turned its face toward the diner window, toward Mark. Not toward the room, not toward the counter, toward him. The look was not sweet. It was not the polished, pleading look of a painting meant to make old ladies cry into lace handkerchiefs. It was raw, accusing, and strangely familiar, as if the puppy had found him guilty of something he had not yet done, but was already considering. Looking away. Mark felt the old battlefield inside him go silent. No orders, no radio, no one to blame. Just a window, 2 freezing puppies, and a torn red scarf burning in the snow. He set his coffee down carefully, slid out of the booth, and stood. The moment Mark Sullivan stepped out of Rosewood Diner, the cold struck him with the blunt force of a hand he had once known too well. Snow swept sideways along Main Street, needling his face, filling the collar of his navy working uniform, turning the diner's warm yellow windows into a distant harbor behind him. The two German Shepherd puppies froze when the door opened. The smaller one sank backward into the hollow of the fallen trash can, its wet ears flattened, its ribs trembling beneath clumped black and tan fur. The larger one stayed in front, paws planted in the dirty snow, the torn red scarf hanging from its mouth like a tiny battle flag. Mark had been trained to enter rooms full of danger, to read movement, to separate fear from threat. But there was something humiliating about being stopped by two starving puppies. He took one careful step forward, his palms open. "Easy," he said, his voice low. The larger puppy dropped the scarf, lunged, and snapped at his sleeve. The bite did not break skin. It barely caught fabric. Still, anger flashed through Mark before he could dress it in discipline. For one ugly second, he wanted the puppy to understand that he was trying to help. Then he heard the foolishness of that thought. Pain did not study intentions. Hunger did not pause to admire kindness. A creature that had learned the world was dangerous did not become grateful just because a man finally decided to step outside. A man in a dark wool coat hurried past, his hat pulled low over his eyebrows. He glanced at Mark, then at the puppies, and gave the kind of uncomfortable half-shrug people offered when they wanted to be excused from a scene without officially joining it. Across the street, a young mother tugged her little boy closer to her side. The child, round-faced and red-cheeked beneath a blue knit cap, tried to look back at the puppies, but his mother whispered something and kept walking. Mark watched them go and felt the old knot tighten in his chest. He knew that walk. Not cruelty, exactly. Avoidance. The civilian version of retreat. People told themselves they were busy, unqualified, too tired, too poor, too late. Maybe all of that was true. Maybe every person passing by had a sorrow in their pocket. But two puppies were still shaking beside a trash can, and truth did not keep anyone warm. He crouched slowly, ignoring the wet slush soaking into one knee. The smaller puppy pushed deeper into the metal can, making a faint scraping sound. Its eyes were dark, glassy, and too quiet. That frightened Mark more than the larger one's teeth. Noise meant fight. Silence meant the body had begun saving what little life it had left. He reached toward the bread crust lying near the trash and broke off a piece. The larger puppy growled. Its voice was small but fierce, a threadbare trumpet before a castle wall. Mark almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it hurt. "All right," he murmured. "You're in charge." He set the bread down in the snow and slid it forward with 2 fingers. Then he leaned back and waited. Waiting had never been Mark's gift. He had spent half his life moving toward objectives, carrying the terrible belief that action could redeem almost anything. But the street offered him no clean mission. There was only wind, the stink of wet trash, the diner glass fogged behind him, and 2 animals deciding whether his stillness was a trick. After a long moment, the smaller puppy stretched its neck from inside the trash can. It took the bread in tiny bites, then stopped after only 1 mouthful. Instead of finishing it, the puppy dragged the rest back into the darkness of the can and tried to tuck it under a crushed paper cup. Mark stared. Something inside him shifted. This was not simple hunger. This was memory wearing fur. The diner door opened behind him. Helen Carter came out, wrapped in a faded green cardigan beneath her winter coat, her silver bun already gathering snowflakes. In one hand she carried 2 old towels, thin from years of washing. In the other she held a shallow bowl of warm milk. Her face, usually shaped by practical humor, had gone solemn. "I was hoping they'd let you be the handsome hero," she said, setting the bowl down several feet from the puppies. Looks like they prefer making you work for it." Mark exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh. Helen's humor did not erase the cold, but it put a little lamp beside it. The larger puppy sniffed the air, suspicious of the milk, suspicious of Helen, suspicious of Mercy itself. Helen did not move closer. She only lowered one towel onto the snow and stepped back. "No rush, babies," she whispered. "Around here, nobody trusts the menu the first time either." Inside the diner, faces had gathered near the window. Ed Palmer, a 63-year-old delivery driver with a thick gray mustache, broad belly, and hands permanently roughened by cardboard boxes and winter steering wheels, frowned over his coffee. Ed was not a cruel man, but he had lived long enough to become loyal to inconvenience avoidance. "Helen better not bring those muddy things through the dining room," he muttered. Beside him sat Nora Finch, a thin, 74-year-old retired school secretary with pearl earrings, sharp blue eyes, and a habit of correcting people even when kindness would do. She tapped her spoon against her cup and said, "Ed, you tracked in more mud last Tuesday than those poor things have body weight." A few customers chuckled. Ed looked offended, then embarrassed, then wisely returned to his pie. Mark heard none of it clearly through the glass, but he saw the watching. That was almost worse. He felt like a man kneeling on a stage, judged by people who wanted compassion performed neatly, without smell, fear, or delay. The larger puppy crept toward the milk, keeping its body between Helen and the smaller one. It drank once, then backed away as if warmth might demand payment. Helen's eyes softened. Mark slid the second towel closer. This time, the larger puppy did not bite. It only trembled. Carefully, Mark lifted the smaller puppy first, towel and all. The little body went rigid in his hands. So light he felt a strange anger at the world for allowing bones to weigh so little. The larger puppy barked once, a cracked, desperate sound, and sprang toward him. Mark turned his arm so the puppy caught his sleeve again instead of his hand. "I know," he said. "I'd hate me too." It took several minutes, 2 towels, half the bowl of milk, and Helen blocking the diner door with the authority of a queen defending a drawbridge. But Mark finally carried both puppies inside. Warmth swallowed them. The smaller one shook harder at first, overwhelmed by the sudden change, while the larger one twisted in the towel, still trying to guard, still trying to fight a war it was too young to name. Helen led Mark past the counter toward a narrow hallway behind the kitchen. A few customers leaned away as the wet puppies passed. Ed Palmer lifted his boots off the floor as if drowning were possible from puppy water. Helen noticed and gave the room a look. "If anyone here has never dirtied a floor with a bad decision," she said, "I'll mop for free the rest of my life." Laughter rose, small and uneasy. Then quiet followed, because everyone understood she was not only talking about dogs. The storage room behind the kitchen was cramped but warm, crowded with canned peaches, flour sacks, extra napkins, and the smell of cinnamon from pies cooling nearby. Mark lined a cardboard produce box with towels while Helen plugged in a small space heater she insisted was perfectly safe, though it rattled like it had fought in Korea. The puppies huddled in the box. The smaller one hid its face beneath the towel. The larger one stayed upright, swaying with exhaustion, eyes locked on Mark. On the floor near his boot lay the torn red scarf, wet and stained from the trash. Mark picked it up between 2 fingers. It seemed useless now, just a rag of red wool carrying the sour smell of garbage and snow. He turned toward the trash bin by the door. Helen saw it and went still. The color drained from her face so quickly that Mark stopped. "Don't throw that away," she said. Her voice had lost all its diner warmth. She stepped closer and took the scarf with both hands, gently now, as though it were not trash but a wounded bird. Her thumb moved across the pattern. Uneven ribs, a small twist in the stitch, a border made with old-fashioned patience. "I know this work," she whispered. Mark watched her expression change from recognition to worry. "This looks like Margaret Wilson's knitting." He waited. Helen swallowed, eyes fixed on the torn red wool. "She's a widow, lives at the far end of Briar Lane. Gray hair, gentle hands, always made scarves for folks who looked colder than they admitted." Helen lifted her gaze to Mark, and the storage room suddenly felt much smaller. "But Margaret hasn't been seen around town in almost a month." By early evening, the storm had thickened over Maple Falls until the streets looked less like roads and more like pale rivers of wind. Mark Sullivan drove Helen Carter's old station wagon because his own truck was parked 3 blocks away near his father's house, buried under snow and old reluctance. Helen sat beside him with a towel-wrapped puppy on her lap, one hand resting gently over the small bundle, as if warmth could be pressed into bones by patience alone. Mark kept the larger puppy tucked inside another towel on the passenger side floorboard, close enough for his boot to feel every tremor. The little guardian had not stopped watching him. Even exhausted, even shivering, it kept its dark eyes lifted, as though Mark were a boarder it had no intention of trusting. The smaller puppy made almost no sound. That silence bothered him more than the growling. Mark had known men who shouted through pain, and men who went quiet when the pain had gone too deep for language. The quiet ones stayed with him longer. Helen guided him through the snow-glazed side streets toward Bennett Animal Clinic, a modest brick building with a green awning and a porch light that flickered as if it, too, were tired of winter. Dr. Laura Bennett opened the clinic door before Mark could knock. She was 61, tall and narrow-shouldered, with iron-gray hair cut in a practical bob, pale, freckled skin, and clear hazel eyes that had learned to look at suffering without flinching. She wore navy scrubs under an oversized cardigan with paw-print buttons, and one knee moved stiffly from an old horseback riding accident she never talked about unless someone tried to carry something heavy for her. Laura had the dry temperament of a woman who had spent 40 years telling people difficult truths about creatures they loved. She could be blunt enough to bruise pride, but animals leaned toward her voice as if they heard the kindness beneath the sandpaper. "Helen called," she said, stepping aside. "Bring them in. And Mark Sullivan, don't stand there looking like a monument. Close the door before my heating bill files for divorce." Helen gave a tired laugh, but Mark only nodded. The clinic smelled of antiseptic, clean towels, and the faint animal musk that no amount of mopping ever fully defeated. In the examination room, Laura set the smaller puppy on a warmed blanket beneath a lamp. The larger puppy fought the towel, weakly but with offended dignity, until Laura paused and lowered her hand without touching it. "Well," she murmured, "you've been promoted to captain of a very small army, haven't you?" The puppy blinked at her. Mark watched, arms folded, feeling useless in a place where strength meant gentleness measured in inches. Laura examined them slowly. She checked gums, paws, eyes, ribs, breathing, and body temperature. The smaller one trembled but did not resist. The larger one resisted everything on principle, though its growl faded when Laura spoke in that low, steady tone that made even the fluorescent lights seem less harsh. "They're cold and underfed," Laura said at last. "Mild hypothermia risk, but not beyond us if we're careful. No big injuries that I can see." She lifted one tiny paw, studying the nails. "But these two weren't born wild. Nails aren't badly overgrown. Coats were brushed recently enough to matter. And look here." She touched the larger puppy's neck, parting damp fur to reveal a faint circular mark where a collar had rubbed. Then she checked the smaller puppy and found the same pale impression. Someone had collars on them. Someone held them, fed them, likely kept them inside or in a sheltered place until recently. Mark looked toward the 2 puppies again. The story changed shape in his mind. Not strays, then. Not just winter's forgotten scraps. Something had interrupted a home. Something had left 2 lives outside a diner window where people could look away in comfort. Helen stood near the sink, twisting the torn red scarf in her hands. "Laura," she said softly, "this looks like Margaret's work." The name settled into the room, and Laura's expression changed. Not surprise, recognition, followed by the weary concern of someone seeing the missing piece of a puzzle she had hoped would not fit. "Margaret Wilson," Laura said. "Widow of a railroad man, lived down on Briar Lane." Mark turned. "You knew her?" Laura's mouth tightened. Everybody knew Margaret, in the way small towns know good people. Not enough to help properly, just enough to praise them when they made everyone else feel decent. There was no cruelty in her voice, only tired accuracy. She explained that Margaret was in her late 70s, a small-boned woman with soft white hair, blue eyes that watered in the cold, and hands permanently curved from years of knitting. Her husband, Earl Wilson, had worked the old rail line before it shut down, and after he died, Margaret had filled her small house with baskets of red yarn. Every winter, she knitted scarves for children who forgot mittens, elderly neighbors too proud to ask for help, veterans who sat alone at the Memorial Day breakfast, and strangers who looked, as Margaret once put it, cold from the inside out. "A few weeks ago, she fell on her back steps," Laura continued. "Mailman found her. She was taken to County General, then moved to a temporary nursing facility for rehab." Helen closed her eyes briefly. "And her house?" "Locked up," Laura said. "That's what I heard." Mark's jaw tightened. "Did no one check for animals?" Laura looked at him then, not defensively, but with the expression of a woman who had asked herself the same thing too late. "People assumed there weren't any. Margaret never mentioned puppies to me. She fed birds, cats, half the neighborhood when she could. But German Shepherd pups?" She glanced toward the exam table. "That part is new." A sound came from the hallway. Mark turned quickly. A teenage boy stood near the clinic's front desk, one hand still on the doorknob as if deciding whether to flee. He was about 16, thin and long-limbed, with sandy blonde hair sticking damply from under a cheap black knit cap, a narrow face dotted with freckles, and gray eyes that looked older than they should have. His coat was too light for the weather, and his boots were splitting at the seams. Helen recognized him first. "Noah Miller, you'll freeze in that jacket." Noah gave a shrug meant to look casual and failed. "I was just dropping off the towels from the diner." Mark studied the boy. There was a particular kind of fear in him, not the fear of guilt exactly, but of being noticed while carrying something heavy. Noah worked odd jobs around Rosewood Diner, shoveling the back entrance, carrying deliveries, wiping tables when Helen paid him in cash and pie. His father had lost work at the lumber yard. His mother worked double shifts at a care home, and Noah had learned early that being invisible was sometimes the safest way to keep a family from cracking louder. The larger puppy lifted its head and made a faint sound. Noah's eyes moved to the exam table before he could stop them. The look lasted only a second, but Mark caught it. Recognition. Pain. Then the boy looked down. "You've seen them before," Mark said. It was not a question. Noah's shoulders tightened. "Maybe?" Helen took one step toward him, gentle but firm. "Noah?" The boy swallowed. "Around Mrs. Wilson's place. I saw them by the shed maybe twice. I thought somebody was handling it." His voice thinned. "Then the snow got bad. Dad said to quit wandering around and mind my own business. I didn't know they'd end up." He glanced at the puppies and stopped. Shame reddened his face. Mark felt anger rise, quick as flame, but beneath it he recognized something more uncomfortable. The boy's excuse sounded too human, too familiar. How many times had grown men used cleaner language for the same thing? Not my mission, not my call, not enough information? Before Mark could speak, the smaller puppy gagged.
Laura moved fast, turning it gently. The pup coughed up a wet clump of paper and half-digested scraps onto the towel. Helen covered her mouth. Laura carefully separated the wad with gloved fingers, and among the mess was a small piece of damp paper, the ink blurred but not gone. Mark leaned closer as Laura flattened it beneath the lamp. Only a few words remained, written in a trembling hand. "Please feed them until I come home." The room went still. Even the larger puppy stopped growling. Mark stared at the note until the words seemed to burn through him.
These puppies had not been thrown away by love. They had been left in the space between an accident and an assumption, between one old woman's hope of returning and a town too busy to check the shed. Outside, the storm pressed against the clinic windows. Inside, Mark felt something colder than snow settle in his chest. The real danger had not been the weather. It had been how quietly everyone, including him, could almost let need disappear. By the time Mark Sullivan reached Briar Lane, night had begun folding itself over Maple Falls, softening the edges of rooftops and turning every porch light into a blurred yellow star. The storm had eased, but only enough to make the silence more noticeable. Snow lay thick over the narrow street, smooth and white, except for the tire tracks left by the county plow and the wandering prints of small animals searching for shelter. Mark had left the 2 German Shepherd puppies at Bennett Animal Clinic under Dr. Laura Bennett's careful watch, with Helen Carter promising to sit beside the smaller one until it stopped trembling. He should have felt relieved. Instead, the quiet inside his truck felt like an accusation. The note from the puppy's stomach kept repeating in his mind, "Please feed them until I come home." It was not a command. It was worse. It was trust, written by someone who believed the world would do the decent thing while she was gone. Margaret Wilson's house stood at the far end of the lane behind a low white fence, half buried in snow. It was small, pale blue beneath the porch shadows, with dark green shutters and a roof line sagging slightly under the weight of winter. Nothing about it looked abandoned in the dramatic way old houses did in ghost stories. There were no broken windows, no wild branches clawing at the siding, no warning signs nailed to the door. A wreath of dried pine cones still hung neatly beside the entrance. Lace curtains rested behind the glass. A ceramic robin sat on the porch rail, wearing a little cap of snow. That was what unsettled Mark most. The house did not look ruined. It looked paused, as if someone had stepped out for a moment, expecting to return before the kettle cooled, before the yarn rolled from the basket, before 2 puppies learned that waiting could become hunger. On the porch, Mark found the first bowl. It was blue plastic, frozen solid, with cloudy ice filling it to the rim. A second bowl sat near the back of a wooden rocking chair, half buried beneath wind-blown snow. He crouched and brushed it clean with his gloved hand. Dog food had frozen into the bottom in a dark brown ring. Beside the door stood a wicker basket filled with red yarn, the top skein dusted with snow that had blown through the porch screen. A pair of knitting needles rested across an unfinished scarf, the same uneven ribs and old-fashioned border Helen had recognized at the diner. Mark touched the edge of the yarn and felt a strange tightness behind his ribs. In combat, he had seen rooms left in panic, meals abandoned, chairs overturned. This was different. This was an ordinary life interrupted so gently that the interruption itself became cruel. He walked around the side of the house, boots sinking into snow almost to the ankle. Behind the property stood a narrow shed with a slanted roof and a latch that had not fully caught. The wind moved the door just enough to make it knock softly against the frame. Mark paused before opening it, listening. No barking, no scratching, only the faint creak of wood and the distant groan of a tree under ice. Inside, he clicked on his flashlight. The beam moved across stacked flower pots, a rusted rake, folded lawn chairs, and then stopped on a small nest of blankets in the corner. The blankets were rumpled and lined with old towels. Nearby sat an empty bag of puppy food, rolled down to the last crumbs. 2 cheap rubber toys lay beside it, one shaped like a bone and the other like a duck with most of its squeak chewed out. Mark stood very still. It was clear now. Someone had made this corner warm. Someone had expected to come back. The puppies had not been wandering at random when they ended up outside Rosewood Diner. They had been pushed, step by step, by cold, hunger, and a promise that lasted longer than the food. On a shelf above the blankets, tucked behind a tin of old buttons, Mark found a round cookie tin decorated with faded Christmas bells. He opened it carefully. Inside were 2 small collars, one red and one navy blue, both worn but clean. Each had a little metal tag. The red tag read Maggie. The blue one read Scout. Mark whispered the names before he meant to. Maggie, Scout. Names changed things. Before, they had been 2 puppies, 2 freezing shapes outside a window, 2 reasons for people to feel guilty. Now they were Scout, the quiet one who hid bread for tomorrow, and Maggie, the little guardian with teeth too small for the war she kept declaring. Mark felt the names settle over them like blankets. A crunch of snow came from outside. Mark snapped the flashlight toward the door. Noah Miller stood in the yard, his thin coat zipped to his chin, sandy hair escaping from beneath his black cap. The boy's cheeks were red from cold and fear. For a second, he looked ready to bolt.
"Don't run," Mark said. The words came out harder than he intended. Noah flinched. Mark stepped out of the shed carrying the tin. "You knew this was here." Noah looked at the ground. "I knew about the shed." His voice was small, almost swallowed by the snow. "Mrs. Wilson showed me once, said if anything ever happened, there was food in there. She thought she'd be home quick." Mark stared at him. "And when she wasn't?" Noah's jaw tightened. He was a 16-year-old boy with too much worry on his face, too little fat under his skin, and the hunted posture of someone who had learned that every adult question could become a trap. "I came twice," he said. "Maybe 3 times. I fed them. Then the storm got bad. My dad found out I was walking over here and yelled at me to stop messing around on other people's property. He said we had enough trouble at home." His eyes flashed, defensive now. "You don't know him. He lost his job. He's not bad. He's just loud when he's scared." Mark heard the plea hidden inside the explanation. "Do not make my father the villain." The boy's loyalty irritated him because it was painful and familiar. Mark had defended his own father once with the same clenched desperation, back when he still believed love required lying for the people who hurt you by neglect. Not fists, not violence, just absence and disappointment stacked high enough to block the sun. "Those puppies nearly froze," Mark said. Noah's face changed as if the words had struck him. "I know. Knowing doesn't feed them." The sentence landed too sharp. Too much command, too little mercy. Noah's eyes filled, but he blinked hard and turned away before the tears could become visible. "I said I know." Then he walked quickly toward the street, shoulders hunched, leaving a narrow trail through the snow. Mark let him go, and almost immediately regretted it. The yard seemed larger without the boy in it, emptier, colder. He looked down at the tin in his hands and saw his own reflection warped in the curved metal lid. Beard dark with melted snow, jaw set, eyes hard enough to frighten a kid already carrying shame. He had used the old voice again, the voice that solved problems by pushing, the voice that made men move, doors open, dangers shrink. But boys were not doors. Shame was not a lock one could kick in. Mark closed his eyes briefly. He had thought anger meant he cared. Maybe sometimes it only meant he was afraid of seeing himself in someone else's failure. Before leaving, he checked the tin again beneath the flashlight. Under the collars lay folded scraps of paper tied with a red thread. At first, he expected vaccination receipts or notes about feeding schedules. Instead, he found a list written in Margaret Wilson's careful, slanting hand. Names filled the page, each followed by a small note. Helen Carter, soup when Walter passed. Laura Bennett, blue scarf after surgery.
Nora Finch, mittens, though she insisted she hated gifts. The list went on, a quiet ledger of kindness offered without witnesses. Near the bottom, Mark saw his own name, Mark Sullivan. His breath stopped. Beside it, Margaret had written, "The boy at the train station that winter would not take the scarf, but needed it most." For a moment, the shed, the snow, and the little collars disappeared. Mark was 11 again, sitting on a cold bench outside the old rail station, pretending not to wait for a father who had forgotten him. He remembered a small woman with white hair placing a red scarf beside him, not forcing it into his hands, not asking questions that would expose his pride. He had walked away without taking it. Or he thought he had. But apparently Margaret Wilson had remembered the boy anyway. Mark stood in the shed behind her quiet house, holding the names of 2 puppies and a kindness he had spent 35 years forgetting. The woman he was trying to understand was not a stranger. She had seen him once when he was cold from the inside out. Mark carried Scout through the back door of Rosewood Diner, just as midnight settled over Maple Falls, quiet and pale beneath the last drifting snow. Maggie followed close behind in Helen Carter's arms, wrapped in a towel, but still twisting her head to keep Scout in sight. The alley behind the diner smelled of wet cardboard, cold grease, and winter metal. But inside the storage room, the air was warmer, softened by the low hum of an old space heater and the lingering sweetness of pies cooling in the kitchen. Helen had cleared a corner between flour sacks and canned peaches, laying down towels, a shallow bowl of water, and a cardboard produce box lined with napkins. To anyone else, it might have looked like a poor little shelter. To Scout and Maggie, it must have looked like a room full of traps. Scout pressed himself flat against the wall as soon as Mark set him down, his tiny blue collar loose around his thin neck. Maggie planted herself in front of him, red collar crooked beneath her damp fur, eyes dark and defiant. She was exhausted, shivering, and too small to frighten anything larger than a biscuit, but she bared her teeth as if guarding a kingdom. Mark crouched, studying them the way he used to study frightened young recruits before a training dive. Fear had patterns, panic had tells. He knew how to bring order to chaos. Keep the voice steady, keep the body controlled. Give one clear command at a time. "Stay," he said softly, lifting one palm. Maggie growled. Scout turned his face away from the bowl of softened food Helen had warmed for him. Mark tried again, quieter. "Eat." Scout did not move. Maggie stepped over the bowl and stood between it and Mark, as if food coming from a man still belonged to the man. Mark felt frustration rise from somewhere old and military. He had negotiated storms, gunfire, impossible terrain, and men who swore they were not afraid while fear poured off them like smoke. Yet one hungry puppy refused to eat because Mark was watching. He turned his head toward Helen, who stood in the doorway with her arms folded. "They need food." Helen's eyebrow rose. "That's usually why bowls exist." "He won't eat." "Maybe he doesn't want an audience." Mark looked back at Scout. The puppy's eyes were open but distant, fixed on nothing, his little body saving energy the way a candle protects its last flame. Dr. Laura Bennett arrives 20 minutes later, her gray hair tucked under a wool cap, navy coat dusted with snow, and a leather medical bag in one hand. She looked around the room, then at Mark's rigid posture. "You're standing like you're about to brief Congress," she said. Sit down before you scare the fleas off them." "They don't have fleas," Helen said. Laura gave her a look. "Small mercies still count." Mark stepped aside as Laura checked Scout and Maggie again. She moved slowly, never cornering them, never making her hands sudden. Maggie growled when Laura touched Scout's paw, but Laura only murmured, "I know, Captain. Your unit is very impressive." When the exam was done, Laura turned to Mark. "No commands tonight." Mark frowned. "They need structure." "They need safety before structure. There's a difference." He looked unconvinced, so Laura's voice softened, though not enough to lose its edge. "You can't outrank fear, Mark. You can only outlast it. Sit where they can see you. Don't stare. Don't reach. Don't keep proving you're stronger. They already know people are stronger. That's the problem." The words landed harder than Mark wanted to admit. After Laura left, Helen dimmed the storage room lights until the corners grew gentle. The old space heater rattled like a box of coins. Somewhere beyond the wall, the diner's neon sign buzzed faintly in the window. Mark sat on the floor with his back against a shelf of canned tomatoes, knees bent, hands open and empty. Scout remained pressed against the wall. Maggie stayed in front of him, eyelids drooping, then snapping open whenever Mark shifted his weight. Nothing happened for a long time. No grand moment, no sudden surrender, no swelling music, unless a leaking faucet counted as percussion. Mark almost smiled at that thought, then let the smile fade. He had spent years believing stillness meant waiting for the next threat. Tonight, stillness was the only gift he had left to offer. A soft knock came at the back door. Helen opened it before Mark could move. Noah Miller stood outside, thin shoulders hunched against the cold, sandy hair damp beneath his black cap. In his arms he held a small bag of puppy food, the cheap kind from the corner store, with a bright cartoon dog printed on the front. His cheeks were red, but not only from weather. "I bought this," he said, not looking at Mark. With snow shoveling money, Helen stepped aside without making a fuss. Noah entered carefully as if guilt were something that might spill if carried too fast. Mark stood halfway, then stopped himself and sat back down. "Noah," he said. The boy stiffened. Mark searched for the right words and found only plain ones. "I was too hard on you at Margaret's shed." Noah stared at the floor. "I should have done more." "Maybe." The answer made Noah flinch. But Mark continued before it could become another wound. "And I should have known better than to talk to you like fear was laziness." The room went quiet. Helen, still at the doorway, looked down at the coffee cup in her hands as if giving both of them privacy inside her own diner. Noah sat on the floor a few feet from Mark. He did not say he forgave him. He did not say everything was all right. Instead, he opened a stack of paper towels and began tearing them into soft strips for the puppy's box. Mark joined him. The work was small, almost foolish. 2 males, one battle-worn and one barely grown, sitting on a diner floor at midnight, making bedding for creatures that did not trust them. But something in that foolishness felt holy. Noah's hands were quick and nervous. Mark's were larger, scarred across the knuckles, clumsy with paper. After a while, Noah whispered, "My dad yells when he's scared." Mark tore another strip. "A lot of men do." "Do you?" Mark looked toward Scout and Maggie. "More than I want to." Noah nodded, accepting the answer without polishing it. Near dawn, the storage room had settled into a hush so complete that even the heater seemed to breathe softer. Helen had turned off the hallway light and stood outside the half-open door, watching without entering, as though too much brightness might break whatever fragile thing was forming. Maggie had finally lowered herself onto the towels, still between Scout and the room, but her growl no longer followed every movement. Scout lifted his head. Slowly, he crept toward the torn red scarf that Helen had left drying over the edge of a box. He took it in his mouth, dragged it across the floor with solemn effort, and placed it beside Mark's boot. Then he backed away, only a little, trembling, uncertain but not hiding. Maggie watched with one eye open, too tired to object. Mark did not reach for Scout. He did not praise him, did not make the moment carry more weight than it could bear. He only looked at the red scarf lying near his foot and understood that trust did not arrive like a soldier reporting for duty. Sometimes it came as a frightened little animal, carrying a torn piece of warmth, asking not to be chased. Mark carried Scout through the back door of Rosewood Diner, just as midnight settled over Maple Falls, quiet and pale beneath the last drifting snow. Maggie followed close behind in Helen Carter's arms, wrapped in a towel, but still twisting her head to keep Scout in sight. The alley behind the diner smelled of wet cardboard, cold grease, and winter metal. But inside the storage room the air was warmer, softened by the low hum of an old space heater and the lingering sweetness of pies cooling in the kitchen. Helen had cleared a corner between flour sacks and canned peaches, laying down towels, a shallow bowl of water, and a cardboard produce box lined with napkins. To anyone else, it might have looked like a poor little shelter. To Scout and Maggie, it must have looked like a room full of traps. Scout pressed himself flat against the wall as soon as Mark set him down, his tiny blue collar loose around his thin neck. Maggie planted herself in front of him, red collar crooked beneath her damp fur, eyes dark and defiant. She was exhausted, shivering, and too small to frighten anything larger than a biscuit, but she bared her teeth as if guarding a kingdom. Mark crouched, studying them the way he used to study frightened young recruits before a training dive. Fear had patterns. Panic had tells. He knew how to bring order to chaos. Keep the voice steady, keep the body controlled. Give one clear command at a time. "Stay," he said softly, lifting one palm. Maggie growled. Scout turned his face away from the bowl of softened food Helen had warmed for him. Mark tried again, quieter. "Eat." Scout did not move. Maggie stepped over the bowl and stood between it and Mark, as if food coming from a man still belonged to the man. Mark felt frustration rise from somewhere old and military. He had negotiated storms, gunfire, impossible terrain, and men who swore they were not afraid while fear poured off them like smoke. Yet one hungry puppy refused to eat because Mark was watching. He turned his head toward Helen, who stood in the doorway with her arms folded. "They need food." Helen's eyebrow rose. "That's usually why bowls exist." "He won't eat." "Maybe he doesn't want an audience." Mark looked back at Scout. The puppy's eyes were open but distant, fixed on nothing, his little body saving energy the way a candle protects its last flame. Dr. Laura Bennett arrives 20 minutes later, her gray hair tucked under a wool cap, navy coat dusted with snow, and a leather medical bag in one hand. She looked around the room, then at Mark's rigid posture. "You're standing like you're about to brief Congress," she said. "Sit down before you scare the fleas off them." "They don't have fleas," Helen said. Laura gave her a look. "Small mercies still count." Mark stepped aside as Laura checked Scout and Maggie again. She moved slowly, never cornering them, never making her hands sudden. Maggie growled when Laura touched Scout's paw, but Laura only murmured, "I know, Captain. Your unit is very impressive." When the exam was done, Laura turned to Mark. "No commands tonight." Mark frowned. "They need structure." "They need safety before structure. There's a difference." He looked unconvinced, so Laura's voice softened, though not enough to lose its edge. "You can't outrank fear, Mark. You can only outlast it. Sit where they can see you. Don't stare. Don't reach. Don't keep proving you're stronger. They already know people are stronger. That's the problem." The words landed harder than Mark wanted to admit. After Laura left, Helen dimmed the storage room lights until the corners grew gentle. The old space heater rattled like a box of coins. Somewhere beyond the wall, the diner's neon sign buzzed faintly in the window. Mark sat on the floor with his back against a shelf of canned tomatoes, knees bent, hands open and empty. Scout remained pressed against the wall. Maggie stayed in front of him, eyelids drooping, then snapping open whenever Mark shifted his weight. Nothing happened for a long time. No grand moment, no sudden surrender, no swelling music, unless a leaking faucet counted as percussion. Mark almost smiled at that thought, then let the smile fade. He had spent years believing stillness meant waiting for the next threat. Tonight, stillness was the only gift he had left to offer. A soft knock came at the back door. Helen opened it before Mark could move. Noah Miller stood outside, thin shoulders hunched against the cold, sandy hair damp beneath his black cap. In his arms he held a small bag of puppy food, the cheap kind from the corner store, with a bright cartoon dog printed on the front. His cheeks were red, but not only from weather. "I bought this," he said, not looking at Mark, "with snow shoveling money." Helen stepped aside without making a fuss. Noah entered carefully, as if guilt were something that might spill if carried too fast. Mark stood halfway, then stopped himself and sat back down. "Noah?" he said. The boy stiffened. Mark searched for the right words and found only plain ones. "I was too hard on you at Margaret's shed." Noah stared at the floor. "I should have done more." "Maybe." The answer made Noah flinch, but Mark continued before it could become another wound. "And I should have known better than to talk to you like fear was laziness." The room went quiet. Helen, still at the doorway, looked down at the coffee cup in her hands as if giving both of them privacy inside her own diner. Noah sat on the floor a few feet from Mark. He did not say he forgave him. He did not say everything was all right. Instead, he opened a stack of paper towels and began tearing them into soft strips for the puppy's box. Mark joined him. The work was small, almost foolish. 2 males, 1 battle-worn and 1 barely grown, sitting on a diner floor at midnight, making bedding for creatures that did not trust them. But something in that foolishness felt holy. Noah's hands were quick and nervous. Mark's were larger, scarred across the knuckles, clumsy with paper. After a while, Noah whispered, "My dad yells when he's scared." Mark tore another strip. "A lot of men do. Do you?" Mark looked toward Scout and Maggie. "More than I want to." Noah nodded, accepting the answer without polishing it. Near dawn, the storage room had settled into a hush so complete that even the heater seemed to breathe softer. Helen had turned off the hallway light and stood outside the half-open door, watching without entering, as though too much brightness might break whatever fragile thing was forming. Maggie had finally lowered herself onto the towels, still between Scout and the room, but her growl no longer followed every movement. Scout lifted his head. Slowly, he crept toward the torn red scarf that Helen had left drying over the edge of a box. He took it in his mouth, dragged it across the floor with solemn effort, and placed it beside Mark's boot. Then he backed away, only a little, trembling, uncertain but not hiding. Maggie watched with one eye open, too tired to object. Mark did not reach for Scout. He did not praise him, did not make the moment carry more weight than it could bear. He only looked at the red scarf lying near his foot and understood that trust did not arrive like a soldier reporting for duty. Sometimes it came as a frightened little animal, carrying a torn piece of warmth, asking not to be chased. Morning came to Maple Falls without sunlight. Only a pale gray lifting behind the diner windows and a soft drip from the icicles along the awning. Rosewood Diner opened late that day, though nobody complained. The town had already learned, through the mysterious telegraph of small places, that something had happened behind Helen Carter's kitchen door. 2 German Shepherd puppies had been pulled from the cold. Margaret Wilson's name had returned like a hymn half-remembered, and Mark Sullivan, the Navy SEAL who had come home only to leave again, was suddenly asking people to gather before lunch. By 10, the diner smelled of coffee, buttered toast, wet coats, and nervous curiosity. Scout and Maggie were in the storage room with the door half open, resting in their towel-lined box. Scout slept with his nose tucked beneath the torn red scarf, as if it were a scrap of fire. Maggie lay beside him, eyes half shut but still alert, her small body angled toward the room like a sentry, too young to retire. Mark stood near the counter, uncomfortable in front of people without a mission briefing to hide behind. He wore his green, gray, brown Navy working uniform, the sleeves rolled neatly, his beard trimmed, his posture straight enough to make every chair in the room feel lazy. But his eyes were different from the night before, not softer exactly, more exposed. Helen moved around him with practiced authority, refilling coffee cups and telling people where to sit, as if seating a church choir before a storm. Dr. Laura Bennett arrived with a folder under one arm and her old medical bag in the other, looking as stern as ever, though she had tucked a red thread through the buttonhole of her cardigan. Noah Miller sat at the end of the counter, shoulders hunched, one hand resting on a small bag of puppy food he had bought with snow-shoveling money. He looked like a boy trying to decide whether guilt could become useful without making a speech first. Ray Collins came in last, which was typical of men who enjoyed being noticed by rooms. His camel overcoat was brushed clean, his polished shoes somehow untouched by slush, and his silver-brown hair was combed into place with municipal confidence. He took off his gloves slowly and looked around at the gathered faces. Nora Finch, sharp-eyed over her tea. Ed Palmer, broad and mustached, pretending he had only stopped by for pie. June Whitcomb, a 78-year-old widow with soft white curls, a tiny frame and hands spotted with age, who wore a faded purple coat buttoned wrong because her fingers had stiffened with arthritis. And Samuel Price, a 56-year-old school bus driver with deep brown skin, a shaved head, heavy shoulders, and a voice so gentle children stopped crying when he used it. Samuel had a quiet steadiness about him, the kind earned from driving icy roads full of other people's children and never once treating that responsibility as ordinary. Ray glanced at Mark. "I hope this won't become a public argument." Helen set down a coffee pot with a thud. "Then don't argue publicly." Mark did not smile. He placed Margaret's cookie tin on the counter and opened it. Inside lay Scout's blue collar, Maggie's red collar, and the damp note Laura had dried as best she could. "Please feed them until I come home." The room grew still. Even the grill seemed to stop hissing. Mark looked at Ray first, not because Ray deserved the honor, but because some doors had to be faced before they could be opened. This town nearly let 2 puppies freeze, because everybody thought somebody else had handled it, he said. His voice was low, not polished. Margaret Wilson fell. Her house was locked. Her animals were left behind by accident and by assumption. That's not one person's failure. That's a system made of people walking past. Ray folded his hands. "No one here wants animals harmed. But turning a diner into a rescue station is not practical." "Good," Laura said, "because no one suggested turning it into one." She opened her folder and laid out a simple plan. The red scarf shelf would be a small corner near the front window. Pet food, warm socks, gloves, meal vouchers, phone numbers for elder check-ins, temporary foster contacts for pets whose owners entered hospital care, and a notice board for quiet help before problems became emergencies. Helen would host the shelf. Laura would offer 1 free wellness clinic a month for animals from struggling households. Mark would organize volunteers to check on elderly residents after storms. Noah, still staring at the counter, whispered, "I can help with deliveries." Helen looked at him, and something in her face softened without embarrassing him. "Yes, you can." Ray sighed. "You are inviting every sad story in Maple Falls to gather in one storefront." June Whitcomb stood before anyone expected her to. She was so small that the table seemed to have been protecting her, but her voice carried.
"Margaret paid my electric bill the winter after my Harold died," she said. "I never told a soul because pride is a stupid little king, and I let it sit on my throne too long." A few people lowered their eyes. June's mouth trembled, but she kept going. "She left the receipt in my mailbox with a red scarf. No note, just warmth." Samuel Price removed his cap and turned it in his big hands. "My youngest had pneumonia when she was 6. Bus heater broke during the morning route. Margaret heard about it and brought 3 scarves to the school before noon. Said children ought to look like Christmas if they had to be cold." He smiled faintly. "My girl still has hers." Nora Finch cleared her throat. "Margaret knitted me mittens." Ed Palmer looked over.
"You hate mittens."
"I said that because I cried when she gave them to me," Nora snapped, though her eyes were wet. "Try keeping up, Ed." Laughter moved through the room, small and grateful. Then Noah stood. His face had gone pale, freckles sharp against his skin. "I saw Scout and Maggie before anyone else did," he said. "I fed them a couple times, then I got scared. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would stop being my problem." He looked toward the storage room where Maggie lifted her head at her name. It didn't. Mark watched the boy and felt the old instinct to rescue him from embarrassment. Instead, he let him finish. Noah swallowed. "I don't want to be the kind of person who only feels bad after something almost dies." That sentence did what Mark's arguments could not. It moved through the diner like a bell. Ray looked away first. Mark placed the collars and the note side by side on the counter. "This shelf won't fix everything," he said. "It won't make Maple Falls rich.
It won't make pain pretty, but it might keep one person from disappearing behind a locked door, and one animal from begging outside a window while we drink coffee inside." Helen walked to the wall beside that same window, lifted the torn red scarf and pinned it carefully where everyone could see it. Beneath it, Ed and Samuel helped drag over an old wooden bookshelf from the hallway. Helen wiped it clean with a dish towel. Noah stepped forward first and placed his small bag of puppy food on the bottom shelf. Laura added a handwritten notice for a free Saturday checkup clinic. Mark reached into a paper bag and removed a new red scarf, folded square, with no name attached. He laid it on the middle shelf, bright and waiting. Spring did not arrive in Maple Falls like a parade. It came shyly, in muddy corners and dripping gutters, in the first brave crocus pushing through the thaw beside the post office steps, in the way people stopped walking with their shoulders lifted against the cold. The snowbanks along Main Street shrank day by day until they became gray ridges of memory, leaving behind cigarette butts, lost mittens, bottle caps, and the small secrets winter had hidden under its white blanket. Rosewood Diner did not become famous. No newspaper arrived to crown Helen Carter a saint, and no tourist bus stopped because of the old wooden shelf beneath the red scarf by the window. But the diner changed in the way old houses change when someone starts opening the curtains again. People came in with cans of soup tucked under their arms, with folded sweaters, with spare dog food, with grocery cards, with phone numbers written on index cards for rides to doctor appointments. Some left things quickly and hurried out, as if generosity embarrassed them. Others stayed for pie. Helen accepted both kinds without comment, because she knew pride had many disguises, and most of them wore church shoes. The red scarf shelf stood where everyone could see it, under Margaret Wilson's torn scarf, now dried, pinned, and honored, like a small banner from a battlefield no one had meant to fight. Scout and Maggie had grown stronger, though not in the polished way people liked stories to end. Scout, the smaller German Shepherd puppy with the blue collar and solemn dark eyes, gained weight slowly, his ribs no longer sharp beneath his black and tan fur. His ears had begun to rise unevenly, one standing proud while the other folded sideways, giving him the expression of a philosopher who had lost his glasses. But on rainy days, or when a truck rattled too loudly past the alley, Scout still carried bits of food beneath towels and napkins, hiding tomorrow from a world that had once failed to provide today. Maggie, with her red collar and darker mask, remained the guardian of everything fragile. She was bigger now, sturdier through the chest, with paws too large for her body and a stare that could make delivery men reconsider their life choices. She did not bite. She only judged. Mark Sullivan sometimes told her she would have made an excellent chief petty officer, and Helen said the Navy had clearly survived worse leadership. Mark adopted them both in March, signing the papers at Dr. Laura Bennett's clinic with a hand steadier than his heart. He did not do it because he felt ready. Readiness, he was learning, was a luxury fear often used to delay love. He did it because love had already entered the room, tracked mud across the floor, chewed a dish towel, and fallen asleep under the same torn red scarf that had accused him through a window. Mark himself did not transform into a man with easy smiles and a healed past. Life was kinder than that, and less dishonest. He still woke some nights with his chest tight, the old operation replaying in fragments behind his eyes. He still disliked crowds, still chose corner seats, still noticed exits before he noticed flowers. But every morning, before opening his father's house for repairs or helping Helen haul coffee sacks from the pantry, he walked to Rosewood Diner with Scout and Maggie padding beside him. He filled 2 clean water bowls outside the back door, checked the red scarf shelf, and wrote down the names of older residents who had not been seen in a few days. Sometimes he and Noah Miller made those visits together. Noah had started volunteering at Laura's clinic after school, sweeping floors, folding towels, and learning how to hold frightened animals without making their fear feel foolish. He was still thin, still cautious, still carrying more worry than a 16-year-old should, but his shoulders had begun to lower. Once, Mark saw Noah laughing while a 3-legged tabby cat stole a pen from Laura's desk, and the sound was so ordinary it felt like Grace sneaking in through an unlocked door. Ray Collins never apologized in public. Maple Falls would probably have stopped rotating if he had. But one clear April morning, Helen found a box of new winter gloves on the red scarf shelf, still wrapped in store paper with no note attached. The gloves were good quality, practical and expensive, the sort of thing a man in polished shoes would buy while pretending he had only meant to look. Helen touched the box, glanced through the window at Ray crossing the street with his briefcase, and said nothing. Mercy, she believed, did not always need a spotlight. Sometimes it needed plausible deniability and a place to set down a pair of gloves. Nora Finch insisted the gloves were too plain to be sentimental, then took a pair for June Whitcomb without asking. Ed Palmer began dropping off pet food every other Tuesday, claiming his supplier had made a mistake. Samuel Price added a clipboard for volunteer rides, and before long, the town that had once walked past 2 puppies in the snow had become a little less skilled at pretending not to see. On a warm morning near the end of April, Mark drove Scout and Maggie to Willowbrook Care Home to visit Margaret Wilson. The nursing facility sat on a hill above town, a long brick building with white columns, trimmed hedges, and windows full of potted plants trying bravely to look cheerful. Margaret sat in the sunroom beneath a quilted lap blanket, smaller than Mark expected. Her white hair brushed back from a delicate face, her blue eyes clouded at the edges but still bright when the light touched them. Age had made her hands thin and curved, the knuckles swollen from years of knitting warmth into other people's winters. She did not recognize Mark at first, or perhaps she recognized him only in pieces. The broad-shouldered man, the gray in his hair, the boy on the train platform hidden somewhere behind his careful eyes. "You look cold," she said softly. Mark smiled, and for once it did not hurt. "I used to be." He placed a red scarf across her lap, not the torn one, but a new one Helen had helped choose. Margaret touched the wool with trembling fingers. Her face changed slowly, like a window filling with morning.
Scout stepped forward and laid his head on her slippered foot.
Maggie settled beside the chair, alert and solemn, guarding the woman who had once guarded them with food, yarn, and a note full of hope. Margaret did not remember every name. She called Scout Little Soldier and Maggie Dear Captain, which Mark decided was close enough. When he told her the shelf at Rosewood Diner carried her red scarf, she looked toward the sunroom window and nodded, as if she had always known kindness should outlive the hands that made it. Mark did not say everything was all right. It was not. Some wounds closed crooked. Some fears kept a bowl hidden beneath the towel. Some boys grew into men who still had to learn, one morning at a time, that keeping warm was not weakness. But when he returned to the diner and sat in the same booth where he had first seen Scout and Maggie outside the glass, the snow was gone. On the sidewalk below the window, 2 muddy paw prints curved toward the door. Mark looked at them for a long while. Then at the red scarf above the shelf. Then at the town moving beyond the glass. Sometimes God did not wake a man with thunder. Sometimes he placed 2 small lives outside a window, left a torn piece of warmth in the snow, and waited to see who still had enough heart to stand. Scout and Maggie were not the miracle Mark expected. They were frightened, hungry, and hard to reach. But maybe that is how God often sends miracles into our lives, not wrapped in shining light, but trembling outside a window, easy to ignore if our hearts are too busy. This story reminds us that compassion is rarely convenient. It interrupts our coffee, our plans, our pride, and sometimes even the version of ourselves we are trying to protect. Mark did not save those puppies by being perfect. He saved them by finally standing up, then learning to sit still long enough for trust to come on its own. That is a lesson many of us need. In everyday life, someone near us may be quietly waiting for a kind word, a warm meal, a ride, a phone call, or simply to be noticed. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part moved you most. Subscribe for more stories of faith, compassion, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your days with peace, strength, and gentle miracles.